Hi, I'm Steve Clemons. I'm Senior Fellow and a co-founder of the American Strategy Program of the New America Foundation, and I'm Editor-at-Large of The Atlantic Magazine. I'm here with my friend and collaborator, Richard Vague, a businessman and credit expert and chairman of the Governors Woods Foundation. He and I have been looking at the relationship between economic growth in an economy and the amount of debt and the kind of debt that it carries. And we're going to give you a short walkthrough with that. Richard, why don't you help lead us into the discussion?
Thanks, Steve. What we really want to do today is take a look at something we call debt to GDP. And we're not just looking at public debt, but we're also looking at private debt, which is business plus consumer debt. Most of the focus has been on public debt, the debate of austerity versus stimulus. We think that private debt, consumer and business debt, really is a more important indicator. Let's pick 1960 as a starting point. From 1960 to 2000, mortgage debt, private mortgage debt, increased by 16% per decade. But then, starting at about 2001, it started skyrocketing. In fact, doubled nominally in a period of about 6 to 7 years. If you look at it as a percent of GDP, it grew 68% in a decade and 46% in just that 6-year period. That rapid buildup in debt was in fact the cause of the Great Recession.
We're about to look at two lines, one from the Great Depression and one from the period just recently, the recession that preceded our economic problems today. What do these lines show?
Well, we saw the buildup in debt prior to the Great Recession, and we really wondered, might that buildup in debt have also been the cause of the Great Depression? And certainly others have suggested it, but the mainstream explanations of the Great Depression have really been other things, monetary policy, this, that, and the other. So we decided to look at the data, and we picked the 10 years prior to the Great Recession, and we picked the 10 years prior to the Great Depression. We put them as a percent of GDP to make them comparable, and then we laid them on top of each other. When we did that, we find these two lines almost sit on top of each other. Over 40% increase to GDP in a decade in the 10 years prior to both crises. Here we see private debt to GDP from 1916 to the present. And as Steve has just suggested, there are only 2 times in the last almost 100 years where private debt to GDP has exceeded 150%, the 1920s and the 2000s. So that gave us a sense that we were onto something. Further, there are only 3 periods in the last 100 years where debt has grown at a rate of about 40% or greater in any 10-year period. The 1920s, the 2000s, and the period right after World War II. And that period right after World War II, private debt to GDP was only 50%. It was frankly a 100-year low in private debt leverage ratio. So to get onto this point, there's 150% private debt to GDP only 2 times, and in both those times, debt is growing extremely rapidly, and they both culminate in the 2 big economic crises of the last century. So you have a very different situation. A lot of pay down after the Great Depression crisis, very little after the Great Recession. You end up after the Great Depression with a very deleveraged nation. Today, even though we have the good news that we didn't have a lot of GDP contraction, we're left with private leverage levels that are the same as they were pre-crisis. We're still carrying around a heavy burden of debt at the consumer and business level. Pay down debt, you have economic contraction. Don't pay down debt, you don't have that kind of economic contraction, but you're left with a continued heavy load of debt. Now, some have suggested that we can grow our way out of this, or that we can use inflation to get our way out of this. When we look at the models and we try to make that happen, It takes a generation or two if you use growth or inflation to get out of these very high levels of debt ratio. To me, that really leaves one alternative that we don't think's been examined as fully as it might, and that is debt restructuring. One of the few ways we can think of to reduce debt ratios without pay down is restructuring. The kind of restructuring that perhaps should have happened at a greater level at the moment of crisis.
Thanks for spending some time with us. What Richard Vague and I have tried to do today is to tweak some of the conventional wisdom about debt and to kind of broaden the spotlight on the private sector dimensions of debt and their interaction with economic behavior and what's happening in our economy today. There are a few key takeaways that I want to highlight. First of all, we feel that private debt has the greatest effect on the economy, and current levels are just too high and need to be restructured. Second, we believe that private debt to GDP has tripled from 50% in 1950 to about 160% today. That seems to us to be a danger zone, really waving red flags. Rapid private debt increases drive asset bubbles, and the key issue here is the rate of change. And that's true, as true in the United States as it is in what we see in Spain and Italy, what we saw in Japan previously. Next, government stimulus to aid the economy is only appropriate when accompanied by private debt correction. In other words, when the government works to try to bail out and buffer working families and the economy from the consequences of an economic shock that happened in the private sector, you've got to at the same time make it incumbent on the private sector world, the private debt world, to restructure these obligations. And finally, debt restructuring is preferable to debt paydown. And what I mean by that is that when you've got a case like the US economy today and you've got massive debt, 160% of debt to GDP, you've got to figure out a way to basically lighten the load without repeating the mistakes of the Great Depression.